Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, a block in the road. The EU has refused to grant China market economy status as lawmakers insist their second largest trading partner fails to meet standards. And a fresh strategy, Apple Inc. pumps a surprise investment of $1 billion into Chinese ride-hailing service Didi Chuxing amid a slowdown in sales in the U.S. tech giants in its second largest market. We begin today's program by China-EU trade ties. Though bilateral trade has been blossoming over the years, the EU has always refused to admit China's market economy status. The EU lawmakers last week overwhelmingly passed a non-legislative resolution with another big denial. China is now EU's second largest trading partner. Why does the EU refuse to recognize China's market economy status? Is China-EU trade relations at risk of deteriorating? Let's take a look at this first before we go to our debate.
Clouding over the skies, the European Parliament voted 540 and 28 against, urging the EU not to grant China a market economy status. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Under the protocols, while China is not yet recognized as a market economy, the EU can refer to the price of products in any substitute country of its choice as a reference point to judge if China is dumping its products. However, conditions in most substitute countries are totally different to China. As a result, China has been the country most vulnerable to anti-dumping lawsuits for 14 years consecutively. But Article 15 of the WTO protocol states that China's status should automatically transit to a market economy status for Europe by December the 11th this year.
We hope and believe that in the 21st century, the European Union will make the wise and right choice when it comes to the question of whether we should be open or exercise protectionism in trade, whether we should keep a promise or break a promise. China has only one simple, clear and reasonable request on this: pure promise.
But European Union lawmakers insist that China fails to meet the criteria defining a market economy. But trade protectionism could be a bigger reason. Many European countries fear that such an endorsement could harm some industries within the EU bloc, like steel and textile manufacturing. The chief negotiator for China's entry into the World Trade Organization, Long Yong-tu, has also called this resolution protectionist, saying it goes against open trade. Though the European Parliament's vote is unbinding, it's creating fears that one of the world's most important trade relations is at risk of deteriorating. China is now the EU's second largest trading partner, with daily trade surpassing $1 billion. With such a large trade volume, there are high hopes that a compromise could be reached between the two sides. In the long run, the EU has more to gain than lose by designating China as a market economy.
For more on the market economy status between China and the European Union countries, we are joined here in the Beijing studio, Mr. Xu Sitao, who is the chief economist from Deloitte China. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Also joining us in Brussels, we are having Mr. Jacques Pelkmans, senior research fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies. Welcome, sir. Meanwhile, in Paris, joining us, Mr. Nicola Casarini, research head for Asia at the Italian Institute of International Affairs. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen. First of all, let's understand technically how this works. Market economy status. According to the Article 15 of China's accession to the WTO, whether or not the European countries grant China so-called market economy status, China is going to have it anyway by the time December the 12th, 2016, which means the end of this year. Isn't that true, Mr. Pelkmans?
Well, certainly it's very difficult to deny that the legal clause in Article 15 that you refer to is unambiguous. But the real issue is not that, even though the Chinese think that is an issue. It's symbolic for them. The real issue is, A, what are the underlying economic circumstances inside China, and what can be done even when the MES, the market economy status, would be granted as you say, automatically to China. These are the real two issues. Because you can grant the MES do a hell of a lot against China if they have good reasons. And these reasons are inside China for the most part, that we can maybe talk on later in this discussion.
Okay, whether it's all inside China or actually the European economies also have their reasons for this participating at least actively in this debate is another question. Let me go to you, Mr. Casarini. This is another difficult or technical issue. This is non-binding. So it means even though the Chinese economy could be having already at the end of the year market economy status according to the accession paper, the European countries have to have the European Commission to come up with a formal suggestion before the Parliament's members vote on it, which means the one that we are talking about right now is non-binding and not necessarily official. Did I understand right?
Yes, it is not binding, but it will have important implications. Why? Because it will give more clout to those member states, in particular the southern European countries, such as Italy, France, and also Spain and Portugal, etc., that are against granting China market economy status. Let's also not forget that the European Parliament will have to give a vote of approval in the end. And this is like a new thing that the European Parliament has gained over the Commission. So although it is not binding, it will have an effect because it will move the European Commission into having to take into consideration the reasons of those member states which are currently against market economy status.
All right, so we got two things clear already, at least from the European perspective. One is legal, the other is political. Let's come to you, Mr. Xu, here in Beijing. Is it still important for China to get, quote unquote, the so-called market economy status?
I think it's important because China has got the same endorsement from over 150 countries. And also it's important because so far the success of China's reform is very much underpinned by external pressure. So external pressure is actually very conducive for China's continued reform. But at the same time, I also believe even China does not get that. I mean, China will continue to move forward.
It's very interesting you talk about the number of countries who have recognized China's market economy status. Let's take a look at some of those. According to WTO, in the year 2014, take a look at this. Its members have launched 236 anti-dumping cases, with 63 involving China, about 27% of the total. China is involved in more anti-dumping cases than any other countries so far. That's because China is not being recognized totally by all countries as a market economy status. But up to now, we've already got a very significant number. 150, more than that, have already granted China so-called market economy status, such as Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Singapore, and many others. So by paper, as we mentioned earlier, Mr. Xu, by the end of the year, December the 12th, 2016, whether so-called you granted or not, automatically China believes it's already a market economy. That was an agreement in China's WTO accession paper signed with all countries.
Yep.
So what would that mean for China? How much really the anti-dumping cases is having a negative impact on the Chinese economy and trade, particularly?
Anti-dumping is a very relevant issue at this juncture for several reasons. Most economies are struggling, slow growth. That's particularly in Europe. Secondly, China is undergoing a very challenging transformation. You want to maintain certain growth rate, you also want to deal with overcapacity and inventory and so on and so forth. So as you can see, anti-dumping becomes more acute issue this year, particularly in certain sectors which are always very sensitive for certain European countries. Steel sector, for example. I mean, the EU started with alliance in steel and coal. So, that sector is very important.
Mr. Pelkmans, we all understand steel lobbying inside the EU countries are extremely strong. And we also understand for a country like the UK, 5,000 jobs have been slashed as a result of the restructuring of economies everywhere in the world, which means a reduction of demand for steel from the UK and elsewhere. But Mr. Pelkmans is at this moment refusing so far apparently to grant China's market economy status a direct link to China's own economic restructuring, or actually to what you have inside the EU for your reluctance to restructure your own economies? Mr. Pelkmans.
Well, I think there's now so many issues already before. If we focus only on steel, it's a little dangerous because.
But what about steel?
Political.
Yeah, but what about steel? Let's talk about steel
and
first.
ceramics. Yeah, it's steel and ceramics. All the other things are more or less normal anti-dumping things. Occasionally they use MES, but if we have no MES, it's really coming down to steel and ceramics, where the overcapacities in China, and I'm no longer so young, but I've never ever seen anything coming even near to these overcapacities. So it's a bit weird to talk about overcapacities in Europe, which are tiny. At the moment there is some of it, but I mean you talk about way over 100 times as much in China, and that's a Chinese very expensive problem for China.
It is an
We have
expensive.
roughly
Let me just get the thing clearly here. What we talk about now is the Europe position of not to grant China's market economy status. It's not about how China is streamlining its own economy. It's already going on. That China is restructuring its economy. As a result of that, there has been a reduction of demands world over of steel from any country, including from the European countries. And now what you have inside the Europeans, and we can also read from many stories covered by international press, it is mainly the steel industry that is doing the biggest lobbying, supporting not to grant China with the market economy status. So let me just ask you directly, and could you please give me a direct answer, Mr. Pelkmans? What about the steel industry? How much
I was
hope,
giving it, but you interrupted me.
Oh yes, how much hope? Let me just
the steel issue.
Go ahead, sir, if you can.
Yeah, I am an independent. I don't care about any industry. I think of my own. But China's overcapacity in steel is huge and it's long. It doesn't depend on the recent demand fall, which of course has made it worse. Also, the price in the world market have been suppressed. I mean, roughly suppressed. You talk about 30–40% fall because of the China overcapacity. It's not just that Europe has a problem. The problem is that the Chinese overcapacity spill over to the rest of the world economy and have negative effects. Of course it's true that in Britain there is one additional element of the energy prices, but on the continent that's not so. On the continent, and you heard Mr. Casarini speak about some of the southern Italy, Spain and so on.
Okay.
There the sensitivity is not so much on energy, it's really on the dramatic fall and of course a huge import surge from China in the last 1.5 years.
All right.
So I am not so happy with all this anti-dumping business and MES, but I cannot deny the fact that the overcapacities in China should, if China is a market economy, should have led these firms to go broke. Because you cannot have overcapacity, then you make gigantic losses. That is the core of the issue, and that is why the steel lobbies, even if they are lobbies, you're completely right, have a case in Europe because they say, why are these guys not broke?
Got your point, but
they are protected.
Got your point, but the relevant question should also be asked, since the EU countries are already quote-unquote market economies, and therefore why don't the EU governments or the countries just let all of those steel manufacturers go bankrupt rather than listening to their strong lobbies? Mr. Casarini,
well,
if you
first
can,
of all,
let's also give Mr. Casarini a chance to talk. Mr. Casarini, if you can.
As you wish.
Okay.
We wish.
Thank you. This is an important topic, and you're actually right. There are like important and powerful steel lobbies against granting China market economy status, in particular from Italy and the UK. And the UK government, let's remember, is officially in favor of market economy status, but the steel lobby is against the granting of the status. Now, the problem is double. On the one hand, you mentioned 150 countries which have recognized China market economy status, but those countries do not have a large industrial base at risk as much as many of the member states within the European Union which are against. Second point, the lobbies are powerful today because of the growing unemployment. I'm speaking with the Tour Eiffel behind. Let's remember, it's not just Italy and the UK, also France is battling against growing unemployment. So any kind of lobby, industrial lobby, which tries to convince politicians that granting China market economy status would translate into the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs would be listened carefully by lawmakers, in
Right.
particular the European Parliament, which can take non-binding agreements. So I think this explains a bit more why the steel lobby can have so much clout nowadays in the discussion.
This is a very unique situation. You've got already the economic circumstances of countries different from 15 years ago when China signed the WTO. You also got the Chinese economy at a very different stage at this moment. So, Mr. Xu, how do you understand this? Is it still important for China?
I think it's important for China to restructure the economy, but it's also important for China to do that perhaps in a measured fashion, because in the end, you are dealing with the human beings. In the end, you are dealing with a very large sector involving million jobs. I do believe the government is serious about restructuring, but of course you have to do that in a measured way. At the same time, perhaps we should also listen to the voice from Europe. In the end, I think it's going to be some sort of compromise. I do think China should make the restructuring plan perhaps more concrete. And actually, it's in China's best interest to restructure certain sectors, particularly steel, so that the sector can become commercially viable.
May I, from the Chinese perspective, ask you even more about that? Because you see steel industry, of course, as Mr. Polkman mentioned many times and recognized by the Chinese side for a long time, and actions being taken about try to change the overall capacity of steel companies, particularly those smaller ones, non-functional ones. But at the same time, it has to be done over time. Yet overcapacity is not necessarily the reason why a market economy status should be granted and should not be granted.
Right.
So we are talking about two things. One is things that might lead to discussions about the market economy status, but not necessarily direct factors influencing the status itself. So at this moment, as we're approaching December the 12th, very soon, how all sides should be handling this? If I could just add in a few more complicated factors, Mr. Xu. This is not just about the status of the market economy itself. It's also about promises made to both sides between China and European countries. It's also about the basic principles of WTO. And it is also about having a more diversified geopolitics in the world in which China and the European Union and European countries are playing an ever bigger role toward one another. So all of these seem to be things that could be related to the overall discussion. Mr. Xu, this makes things ever more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, to put it simply, China has been benefiting from free trade and globalization, and protectionism would hurt China more than other countries. So it's in China's best interest to listen to our trading partners' concerns, opinions, and meanwhile, we do need to have a more concrete plan in terms of restructuring, for example, zombie companies, not commercially viable companies. Yes.
But at the same time, what does it say to China if the European countries, as China sees it, does not carry its promises, as Mr. Wang, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, said in his recent response toward the news?
That'll be somewhat disappointing because, for example, Russia was getting market economy status from European Union. Even a country like Ukraine has received that status many years ago. So, I mean, it's difficult to argue China is less market-driven than some other countries.
Interesting. Mr. Polkmans, what do you say about the larger impact of the failure to grant China the market economy status, or further debates and disputes about between China and the European countries, economically and also trade-wise, in the long term?
Yeah, in the long term, I think it's obvious that MES should not only be given, but should be practiced in what it means, namely that two market economies, namely China and the EU, trade, and I hope trade a lot and invest in an as free as possible environment. There's a longer run, but at the moment, in the very short run, yeah, as my Chinese colleague just said, this has to be cleared. And whether you do that in 3 or 5 years, that's a very painful period inside China, but also to some extent for us. And that can be done, but not without pain. We have had a steel crisis in the EU, not as gigantic as yours, but still pretty big, between 77 and the early 90s. And I can tell you, we did it too long, and we did it in a very painful and dragged out manner. So we know what we're talking about. No, I absolutely agree. If MES stands for what it's meant, Yong Tu has been very clear all along, because I know him for many years back. This is really about what is behind it. If China wants to become a market economy, then these things would only very rarely or hardly ever occur. Then we would have normal anti-dumping procedures, which many countries do, and this MES thing adds let's say 20-25% to the anti-dumping duties, and that's a lot. And the idea behind it is that it compensates for the artificially low price because you're not a market economy.
Okay, we understand how the anti-dumping works. Yes, indeed, and the price to pay for it. Mr. Casareni, briefly, because we only have very limited time left, from you, what about the longer term and the bigger impact of this discussion? The reason that even the discussion exists, that there are suspicions from one side about the other's lack of implementing promises. What would that mean for China-EU in the longer term economic and trade ties?
That's the most important question, as you rightly mentioned, the future of EU-China relations. First point, the fact that we are discussing is already a good point. Let's remember the United States have already declared they will not recognize China market economy status. So the fact that the European Union is leaving the door open to an eventual compromise is already a success. Second point, I think that if a compromise is achieved, and I do hope that we will have a compromise by December, boost actually EU-China relations. So this kind of like discussions that we have, like the Chinese foreign minister, like saying that the Europeans don't keep the promises, the Europeans are accusing China not to have done enough in order. Those are useful. We are speaking about the possibly most important economic relationship in the world. So any kind of discussion along this line will be useful, and we hope that by December a compromise will be reached, and it will be a key point. Also towards a more diversified dimension, because it will also send a message to countries like Japan that are still reluctant in discussing as to whether grant China market economy status. At least in Europe, we discuss about that.
We are already hearing every perspective coming from our three panelists. Thank you so much. I'm sure discussion will go on, but also it will be watched very closely as to how compromises and promises particularly will be implemented. For now, thank you so much, Xu Sitao, Jacques Pelkman, Nicolas Casareni. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Appreciate it. Stay with us here on World Inside. We've got our final segment coming right up. Taking a surprise turn, Apple Inc. invested $1 billion into Uber competitor Didi Chuxing in China amid a tumble in sales for the U.S. tech giants on the mainland. Welcome back. You're watching World Inside on CCTV News. Smartphone giant Apple is venturing into China's hot technology by investing $1 billion into the popular ride-hailing app Didi Chuxing. This investment is the single biggest that Didi has ever received so far. Apple's chief executive Tim Cook said this move will help the company to understand the Chinese market better. But what's behind this bold deal, as some suggest? First, let's take a look at this background report.
A surprise boost. China's largest online ride-hailing platform now getting an overseas investment. After last year's merger between Didi and Kuaidi, now Didi Chuxing holds nearly 90% of China's private car hailing market and about 99% of the country's taxi hailing market. On Monday, Apple CEO Tim Cook arrived in Beijing and experienced a Didi trip with Didi Jane Liu.
As you know, Apple invested in her company in the last week, and we're very, very proud to have done that. Didi has about 14 million drivers now across China and 300 million users in China. And as of this morning, that's 300 million and one, because Jean and I took a Didi taxi over this morning.
It began as a service for hailing taxis. The Didi app could line up a driver, reveal the number of taxis in the area, and connect you with a driver. Now, Didi also offers ride-sharing, bus hires, financing, and test drive services.
We will use this investment on refining our product into R&D projects like facial recognition, in order to help drivers and customers improve their ride experience.
Analysts say the investment may be a way for Apple to diversify, as revenues fell for the first time since 2003, with sales slowdown in the Chinese market a top reason. Some say a possible reason for Apple choosing Didi is to pave the way for the Apple Car entering China's smart car market.
To make inroads into the Chinese smart car market, local partners and localized operations are key. Didi can serve as Apple's local operation network for Apple cars.
Another area is in payments. Apple launched its Apple Pay app in China in February and may be exploring ways to integrate it with Didi's mobile app. As for Didi, it's perhaps a first step to going global. In the words of Didi's CEO, the investment is an enormous encouragement and inspiration for the 4-year-old firm.
Well, for more on Apple's investment in Didi Chuxing, we are joined here in our Beijing studio, Mr. Jay Wang, who is founder of Jaystone Ventures and also former managing director of Intel China. Welcome, sir, to our program. And also joining us from New York, we are having Mr. Max Wolf, professor of economics of the New School University in New York. Meanwhile, joining us from London, inside the UK, we're having Mr. Jack Kent, who is the director of operators and mobile media at IHS Technology. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, Mr. Huang, how big a deal is this? I mean, $1 billion for Apple does not seem to be an astronomical figure, even though it looks big for an app sharing company like Didi Chuxing. What do you say?
I think this investment reflects, first of all, Apple's commitment to China, to China's economy, especially at a particular time China's economy is slowing down, and also Apple's in the latest quarter and the revenue also going down.
You sound like Mr. Tim Cook.
Okay. Having said that, and you're absolutely right. Having said that, and compared to Apple's and revenue and profit, like in China last quarter, the revenue coming from Greater China, including mainland Hong Kong and Taiwan, is $12.4 billion dollars, and the net income is $2.5 billion.
Quarterly only.
Quarterly only. So Apple just spent half of the quarter net income into this investment. So not really money-wise. However, looking to the Didi and their business model is so-called shared economy.
Right.
People can argue that is the future and the economy, and also given Uber's legal issue in the U.S., and Didi could be the first major shared economy company going initial public offering. So this could be very profitable investment for Apple as well.
I heard a lot of could be, and could be. So will those could be comes into reality? That could be a question as well. But let me go to you, Professor Wolf, by asking you, Apple expresses interest with $1 billion into China's ride-hailing app, Didi. But of course, we all remember the years ago, Google expressed its interest in Uber inside the US. So are we going to see very different choices by different companies coming from the US, the so-called tech giant, in exploring their potential?
Absolutely. Uber has a little bit called history in making and keeping alliances. So it's fairly clear on a number of levels that the Uber relationship with Google has headed somewhat south, with Uber being very aggressive in trying to hire its own robotics team, purchasing its own mapping team and own mapping alternative to the Google Maps, which they usually used. But Google has a huge play, probably a leadership play, into self-driving cars and a huge play into sharing apps, and Apple probably does not want to get left behind. Additionally, I think we should mention that Apple is interested in having good relationships with Tencent, Alibaba, and some of the other companies that have already expressed interest in Didi by making investments. And everybody wants to control the computer environment in the car. So Google's CEOs have sort of famously said, and everyone believes, that the car is the next frontier for the internet. And some folks even refer to the car as a URL, or internet address with wheels.
That's true. So you want to be on the front line, also with all of these partners, so-called BAT in China. Mr. Kent, what about from your perspective? Can Apple, like Google, transform itself from a smartphone company into one that is much more comprehensive by doing what it's doing right now, investing in Didi? Is it a direction? Is it a direction that Apple should take, or it's pretty much a zigzagging road, it seems, that Apple has chosen?
It's important to look at Apple's history when it comes to investments and acquisitions. And traditionally, Apple has largely favored full acquisitions of companies when it comes to launching its own new services. So notably the acquisition of Beats and then the launch of Apple Music, the acquisitions of things like Siri, and different companies to help build its mapping products. With this, it's a very different strategy. It's making an investment in a third party. So it might not give us that crystal ball into what new products Apple will launch, but it certainly shows the importance of a partnership for new technology and also a partnership for China. So we think it's really cementing that position in China, which is the crucial part of this deal.
Is that going to be a future direction of Apple, though, Mr. Ken?
One of the things we do know from Apple that we've seen already we do know that the services business is important for Apple. It made that clear on its last earnings call. So as we're seeing the iPhone business start to slow, the hardware business becoming very important for Apple, but the software and services area is something where it sees a lot of opportunity for growth. And so investments in companies that are very active and very successful in that area will certainly help it.
Mr. Huang here, what do you think about how viable business models are, such as Didi, such as Uber? Of course, at this moment, we understand it's mainly investment coming from outside that has kept all of these business models going. But what about in the future? Of course, you could argue shared economy model than a so-called a real economy. But how should we understand these business models, particularly when you have ever more investors coming into them?
I think the reason we have so much and so many investors coming into this field is that they think this is the future. I personally also believe in. I think the younger generation, their approach to, for example, to transportation, they don't think they need to own the vehicle, and as long as somebody or whoever can take them
provide the service.
Exactly. So this could change and the people's and the perception and also their behavior towards the future transportation. So this is very significant. They're going to impact not just like a taxi industry, could be automobile industry, steel industry as well.
Even when they're using subsidies, they're not worried. Over the past few years, Didi and Uber have been using subsidies to enter the market. It often means big losses, quote unquote, in the very beginning. For instance, let's take a look at this. Uber, it lost $1 billion in the year 2015, it said itself. Didi didn't give official statistics, but said its users took 1.43 billion rides last year, and the average subsidy per ride for that is estimated at $1. So you do the math yourself. Therefore, Mr. Kent, what do you make of the sustainability of this business model? When are we going to decide as a dividing time whether it is the right business model Or will these tech giants, such as Google and Apple, when they come really in-depth into these companies, likely to change it to something else?
Well, I think there's two things. Right now, it's still very much a land grab for users. So companies spending heavily, needing to raise funds to really further that growth. But not just users, you also need to spend a lot of money to get drivers on board onto your platform and really invest and make sure that drivers are seeing the payouts, so that way there's enough drivers on board for the users. But it's interesting that, talking about business models, one of the other factors is that a lot of these apps, ride sharing or car hailing is really one of the first steps, and what they want to become is a platform for other services. So logical first steps in things like food delivery and logistics. But once they've got that active user base, then there can be many more different ways you can potentially monetize the audience.
That's very, very true. Professor Wolf, things could happen very fast.
Yeah, they have moved very quickly in this space. I would say that we have a little bit of a question mark around the space, only because when you are selling a $1 bill for 85 cents, your growth pattern is often very large, but the sustainability of that growth pattern is not so assured, because you need to figure out how to provide the service for less than 85 cents to continue to exist. So certainly this is major disruption to disruptive technology and use case, really, for moving people around. We do think these businesses are here to stay. What form and whether they're independent is a bigger question mark, because it really comes down to how you get people in the car, how you finance the car, and how you move the car around. And for the next few years at least, it's probably going to be a while before the cars are self-driving. So I think we're seeing people try to figure this business out. We're spending a lot of money to figure it out. It's a very exciting story, but it's very, very uncertain where it all ends up. And the real test will be when the investors lose some patience and we see what these companies are worth when they self-sustain, which Uber says they will do, by the way, by the end of 2016.
Another interesting question related to this, Mr. Huang, is where would the change happen? Who would be the most eligible to find so-called the transforming? Is it really from the app companies, likely? Or is it likely more from the technical side? You know, the big tech companies likely to find the next stage forward. It seems that the app thing is easier because all it has to do is to try to get the users and the drivers. Tech could be a big step forward. And meanwhile, a big step forward in the technology could be a huge test, new round for all these app companies as well. So where would the change really happen?
I think that's an excellent question. I would think it's a combination of both.
Are you trying to sit on the fence, sir?
No, I think the tech giant, they're laid out a platform and build up like an ecosystem. All those app companies, and they're just a part of their ecosystem. So that's why we see them and marry together. I think eventually, I personally don't worry about the business model, because I look back and the trajectory of the lots of internet companies and successful path. And usually, like, there's a lot of competitions. Finally, there is one or two that have a deepest pocket. They survive. Rest of them all die. I think the uncertainty in this particular case is more like the legal issues. Like, for example, are those like Uber in the U.S., the Uber drivers are the contractors or their employees, and then, in China's case, and all those non-taxi drivers, and then they're part of the Didi's and fleet. Are they licensed? What's the qualification, safety, etc., etc.? Those are the uncertainty, and there are more uncertainty in that area than in the financial side of it.
What is the biggest change likely to happen? Where is it, Mr. Kent? Legal change, as being mentioned by Mr. Huang, or is it technology that's to drive everything once again to a very different level, or these shared economy app companies likely to bring us new inventions when it comes to models, business models?
Well, when you look at the legal issues that may face these companies, that often points to one of the things which is unique, that it's a very local business for a lot of these companies. Although they want to operate at an international scale, when it comes down to the actual day-to-day business, it can be city regulations, local regulations that they have to work with, which again ties back to some of the need for that investment. But then part also that's important is building that international scale, local regulations, but then you need partnerships, or you need to be present in lots of countries to really build a scalable business. And that's where the funding from technology companies, and where technology companies already have this big scale already, and so that's where you can really see the two working together.
And Professor Wolf, final words from you?
Yeah, I do think we're going to see that the legal challenges are part of the business model. One of the distinguishing features of Web 2.0 or the sharing economy has been that where past businesses have been cautious and asked for permission to enter markets, these folks raise money and ask for forgiveness having crossed the line. That's core to the business model, and that goes as well and as long as it's allowed to by regulators. And I think that's a very important point, but I don't think we 100% know the answer yet.
Well, that's the fascinating part of it, isn't it? Not know the answer yet.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Max Wolf, Jay Huang, Jack Kent. Really appreciate the gentlemen for being with us. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us, or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.